Good morning. This is Garry Glaub in Mooresville, North Carolina. Today we are on Lesson 22 of the Acts of the Apostles, and we're covering Acts chapter 12, verses 1 through 11. This one's called Persecution and God's Grace. Once again, this is a timely Bible passage based on the assassination of Charlie Kirk that occurred recently. That was an incredibly sad event, and based on that single event, changes will occur. Like a pebble thrown into a calm lake, there are waves emanating in every direction. Some of the changes we will be aware of, while there are other changes, some of them major, that we might not see. Personally, to believers, this should be a wake-up call to our calling of preaching, teaching, and speaking the gospel, regardless of how we are perceived, regardless of how we may bring persecution upon ourselves. Yes, a strong believer has been murdered, and it left his wife a widow and left his children fatherless. But at the same time, we know that God remains on the throne, and he allowed this spiteful act for his purposes and for his glory. We also know how God looks at widows and calls us to take care of them, just as he does. Let's read the first passage. Acts chapter 12, verses 1 through 4 says this. Now about that time, Herod the king stretched out his hand to harass some from the church. Then he killed James, the brother of John, with the sword. And because he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded further to seize Peter also. Now it was during the days of unleavened bread, so when he had arrested him, he put him in prison and delivered him to 4 squads of soldiers to keep him, intending to bring him before the people after Passover. First, we need to gain a little more historical perspective concerning who is being discussed here. We see the name Herod, and for most of us, we either think of Herod as a single person who is described in many Bible stories and passages, and think this must have been one evil and hateful man. But there are many men singly referred to as Herod in the Bible. I have gone into this at length before, and in this lesson, I will give a much shorter summary. The first Herod we learn about is Herod the Great. He is the one who had all the male babies 2 years old and younger in the region of Bethlehem put to death after a visit by the Magi, the kings of the east, who were following a star to find the prophesied king who had been born there. Of course, through dreams, God warned Joseph, the husband of Mary, the mother of Jesus, to escape to Egypt with his family. But Herod the Great died, and the next time we are informed in the Bible about Herod, we are discussing a wider variety. After the death of Herod the Great, his territory was divided into fourths, and as occurs with most royalty, his throne was passed down. In Herod the Great's case, that throne was passed down to 4 different relatives. One of those was Herod Antipas, and he is the Herod we are most familiar with. Herod Antipas was the one who beheaded John the Baptist, and also was the Herod who interviewed Jesus on the day of his crucifixion. A second Herod at that time was Herod the Tetrarch, also known as Philip, a brother of Antipas. He had been married to Herodias, who was his niece, making the marriage incestuous. Herodias left Philip and then married Philip's brother, Herod Antipas. Archelaus was another of the tetrarchs, and Herod the Great's sister, Salome, also had been given a few cities. None of those are the Herod mentioned in today's passage. Instead, this is Herod Agrippa, who was a grandson of Herod the Great and the son of Aristobulus IV. Agrippa was brought up in Rome in the palace, and as a child spent much time with the children of Caesar Tiberius, especially Drusus, but also with the nephew of Tiberius, Claudius, who would become Caesar, and also Caligula. When Herod Agrippa was appointed as Herod in Israel, it was no longer a tetrarchy. Instead, Agrippa was the only Herod. In addition, there no longer was a Roman regent in charge of Israel, as Pontius Pilate had been. Though Agrippa was a puppet king and limited by the edicts of Rome, he was the only ruler of Israel at this time and was thought to be ruthless by the Jewish people. One of those ruthless acts was the decapitation of James. Other than the suicide by Judas Iscariot, James would be the first death of one of the apostles of Jesus. Herod arrested James and had him beheaded. It is interesting that James was the first of the apostles, other than Judas, to die, and his brother John would be the last. This action by Herod pleased the Jews, according to this passage, and because it did, Herod Agrippa next arrested Peter. He also planned to kill Peter, as I will explain in the next lesson. But as it was against Jewish law to put someone to death on a Jewish feast day, and it was Passover, Herod Agrippa was waiting for the end of the feast week of unleavened bread. There were 4 squads of soldiers guarding Peter, and there were 4 soldiers in each of the squads. This was called a quaternion. 2 of the soldiers were shackled to Peter, one on his left and one on his right. 2 other soldiers guarded the door. In addition, there were 4 night watches through the night, lasting 4 hours each. So these squads of 4 rotated. That seems like a lot of guards, but we must also consider that after the disappearance of Jesus from a guarded tomb, they were not taking any chances. Let's read the next passage. Acts chapter 12, verses 5 through 11 says this: Peter was therefore kept in prison, but constant prayer was offered to God for him by the church. And when Herod was about to bring him out, that night Peter was sleeping, bound with 2 chains between 2 soldiers, and the guards before the door were keeping the prison. Now behold, an angel of the Lord stood by him, and a light shone in the prison, and he struck Peter on the side and raised him up, saying, Arise quickly. And his chains fell off his hands. Then the angel said to him, Gird yourself and tie on your sandals. And so he did. And he said to him, Put on your garment and follow me. So he went out and followed him, and did not know that what was done by the angel was real, but thought he was seeing a vision. When they were past the first and the second guard posts, they came to the iron gate that leads to the city, which opened to them of its own accord. And they went out and went down one street, and immediately the angel departed from him. And when Peter had come to himself, he said, Now I know for certain that the Lord has sent his angel, and has delivered me from the hand of Herod, and from all the expectation of the Jewish people. The church was in constant prayer for Peter. Up until this time, since the ascension of Jesus, Peter had stepped into the role as leader of the early church, beginning with the sermon on the day of Pentecost. But we also need to notice that this arrest of Peter and the beheading of James just before identifies a conscious attempt by Herod Agrippa to attack the leadership of the early church. Though Stephen had been martyred by the Jewish religious leaders, he was not an apostle. This demonstrates that Herod Agrippa likely had a plan to get rid of all of the apostles, the 12 who had walked with Jesus. Remember, each of those apostles had been gifted with the same signs and wonders that Jesus had amazed people with: the ability to cast out demons, heal the sick, and even to bring people back from the dead. That in itself was a threat to Herod. This passage tells us that Herod was about to bring Peter out of the jail, so the death of Peter was imminent. But an angel of the Lord stood beside Peter. He struck Peter on the side, perhaps to wake him, and told him, Arise quickly. Peter was not sure if he was dreaming. As soon as Peter stood up, his chains fell off. We can see another part of the miracle here, as the prison guards were not awakened. The angel told Peter, Gird yourself and tie on your sandals. With the robe hanging down to the ankles, the angel was telling Peter to draw that robe up so that when they moved quickly, the robe would not trip him. It would be like putting a belt on a loose-fitting pair of pants. Peter still was not sure if this was real or not, but he followed without question. That is another part of the miracle, with the propensity of Peter to ask questions and have a different opinion. They moved through the doors without waking the other guards, and then came to the iron gate. It sounds like this was in the same place where Jesus had been detained, the Antonia fortress. And then they came to the iron gate that could be opened to the city. It was closed, surely to stop any escaping prisoner. But the iron gate opened of its own accord. The angel departed, and Peter was alone. He muttered to himself, "Now I know for certain that the Lord has sent his angel and has delivered me from the hand of Herod and from all the expectation of the Jewish people." There was a united front against the early church that included the government, Herod Agrippa, and the people, the Jews living in Israel. The irony is that Jesus came as the Messiah of the Jews and offered salvation to the Jews first. The God of the Jews was the God of the early church, but the Jews had replaced God with the law. They had lost sight of the promises of God and the attributes of God while still claiming to follow that God. They had killed the Son of God and were united with Herod on killing the apostles. Killing Jesus had not achieved what they thought it would. Remember what Gamaliel, the leading teacher of the rabbis, had stated when the apostles had been imprisoned earlier. Acts chapter 5, verses 34 through 39 says this: "Then one in the council stood up, a Pharisee named Gamaliel, a teacher of the law held in respect by all the people, and commanded them to put the apostles outside for a little while. And he said to them, 'Men of Israel, take heed to yourselves what you intend to do regarding these men. For some time ago, Theudas rose up, claiming to be somebody. A number of men, about 400, joined him. He was slain, and all who obeyed him were scattered and came to nothing. After this man, Judas of Galilee rose up in the days of the census and drew away many people after him. He also perished, and all who obeyed him were dispersed. And now I say to you, keep away from these men and let them alone. For if this plan or this work is of men, it will come to nothing. But if it is of God, you cannot overthrow it, lest you even be found to fight against God." God was demonstrating this to be truth. Because the church was God's plan, he was using every persecution to add to the church daily. As we finish this study, let's discuss prayer. Certainly the church had been praying for James when he had been arrested, just as they were praying for Peter. But God did not have James miraculously released from prison as he had done for Peter. Prayer is something most of us do, but it also is something many really do not understand. Recently, I heard of a pastor who told a believer not to pray for God's will to be done. I was shocked. First of all, we need to understand one of the purposes of prayer. God speaks to us when we read his word, and prayer gives us the opportunity to speak to God. When Jesus died on the cross, the temple veil was torn from top to bottom. That tear began at the top because it was ripped from heaven downward. The temple veil separated the most holy place where the Ark of the Covenant resided from the holy place, and no one was allowed to enter the most holy place, apart from the high priest, who would enter once a year on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. But the death of Jesus changed that. Now all believers can enter the most holy place anytime and any place and talk to God. We do not need to make an appointment. We do not have to do anything special to get God's attention either. He hears every prayer, even when we are just groaning and don't have words to utter. God also answers every prayer. Here's the most important part of that, though. Sometimes his answer is yes, but there are plenty of other times when his answer is either no or not now. God's thoughts are not our thoughts, nor are his ways our ways. He sees everything, knows everything, and in relation, we are much closer to knowing nothing than everything. For us to pray in the will of the Father reveals that we are cognitively aware of the fact that we don't know much. I am not talking down to anyone else, as I also have been guilty of forgetting this. When two of my dearest friends lost a grandchild, and many of us have been praying desperately for God to spare this child's life, I was devastated when the baby died. Ashamedly, my relationship with God suffered. It just didn't seem fair. But that judgment is not up to us. Why should it be when our knowledge is so limited? At the same time, I also struggled with the question of the usefulness of prayer. For if we can pray in boldness, pray in faith, pray in love, and pray in hope, how do we rectify the times when God's answer is no? Through prayer, God involves us in his process. Personally, I think that most of our prayers should involve others instead of self. We already know that Jesus is our mediator and makes intercession for us. Romans 8, verses 33 through 34 says this: "Who shall bring a charge against God's elect? It is God who justifies. Who is he who condemns? It is Christ who died, and furthermore is also risen, who is even at the right hand of God, who also makes intercession for us." James died because it was God's will for that to occur at that very time. Peter was spared, at least at that time, but Peter also would be martyred eventually. Charlie Kirk also became a Christian martyr last week. He spoke boldly of his faith and spoke boldly of his adherence to the words of God in the Bible, in faith, belief, and action. And those beliefs offended many people. Does this mean that we need to tread lightly, afraid of offending others? By speaking truth? Absolutely not. We need to speak the truth in love, knowing that without coming to Jesus, those people will suffer in the lake of fire and brimstone for all of eternity. As stated before, the only choice we really have concerning the acknowledgement of Jesus Christ as Lord is when we will do that. Eventually, at Judgment Day, even those who hate him will bow their knees to him. This is Garry Glaub in Mooresville, North Carolina. Have a blessed day.